What's up, STS Nation, and welcome to another episode of Surviving the Survivor, the podcast that promises to bring you the very best guests in all of true crime. And tonight, you are in for a big treat, although the legend, Dr. Ann Burgess, is still working on a couple of technical issues. However, I think she is hearing us fine at the moment. As we all know, especially these two remarkable guests, Lyle and Erik Menendez were convicted of the grisly 1989 shotgun murders of their parents, Jose and Mary Louise Kitty Menendez, at the family's sprawling Beverly Hills mansion. They've been in prison ever since. But do they now have a new shot at freedom after a bombshell letter surfaced, as well as the release of a new documentary supporting the brothers' claims of sexual abuse by their dad, Jose Menendez, as we lose and signal? But we're going to go here with Dr. John Conti to begin with. The best guests, I will introduce Ann because she will be back on. She's an internationally recognized pioneer in the assessment and treatment of victims of trauma and abuse. As she works to get that line established, I will I'm unable to mute her here. I don't know why. And if you can, mute yourself for a moment. She, of course, is the writer of the book of Killer by Design, Murders, Mindhunters, and My Quest to Decipher the Criminal Mind. Among her many awards and accolades, in 2016, she was named a living legend by the American Academy of Nursing. She also worked with the FBI Academy and their special agents to study serial offenders. The Netflix show Mindhunters is loosely based on her first days of criminal profiling at the FBI, and they are currently Dakota Fanning and her sister are working on a documentary series about Ann Burgess. And then the man scratching his head saying, "What have I gotten myself into?" is Dr. John R. Conti. He's a University of Washington professor and scholar whose area of expertise centers on mental health issues related to child abuse and trauma. He joined the University of Washington School of Social Work. My mother is a social worker. Back in 1990, he is the founding president of the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, and his accolades go on and on. He's also the editor of the Journal of Interpersonal Violence and Trauma, Violence, and Abuse. He knows more about child abuse and sexual assault than pretty much anyone on planet Earth. So welcome to both of you. And Dr. Conti, I'll start with you. This new documentary, I don't even know if you've seen it, but it's stirring a lot of controversy up. And do you think that, along with this new letter, which we're going to get into, is enough potentially for these two now grown men, when you knew them were young men, to possibly be freed from prison?
Well, it's a really good question, and I don't have a good answer. My concern is that it seems like there are a lot of cases that come along and there's new evidence, and there's a tendency in the system not to want to revisit past decisions. So even when there's new evidence about innocence, it seems that it's often hard for defendants to get a new trial. Now that's based just simply as a citizen who reads the newspaper and follows the news. So I don't know what their chances are. Actually, it should, in my opinion, certainly reopen the case because it was information that was not available to us at the time or to the jury.
Dr. Conte, in your opinion, we'll get to the legend Ann Burgess in a moment, but in your opinion, should these two ever have been sent to prison to begin with, or should they have been free men their whole lives?
Well, I think the jury made a mistake in finding them guilty. I think there was sufficient evidence presented at the time of the trial to indicate that there was a history of abuse in the family and that there was reasons that the boys were afraid for their lives. And so, in fact, they were acting in an imperfect self-defense. So I testified, as did Dr. Burgess, and I think we both believed that the abuse had taken place and that they were, when they shot their parents, were operating on irrational fear that their lives were in danger.
And we're going to get into that. Dr. Ann, if you could unmute yourself, and how is the connection better, Ann? Just have to unmute yourself, and hopefully, oh, there it goes. Ann is on a hotspot, just so everyone knows, and it's sort of in the middle of nowhere, which is why she's having an issue, but hopefully she will pop back up. Dr. Conte, it's me and you for right now, riding solo. Do me a favor. For those who aren't aware, who weren't, who might be a little bit younger, what was the magnitude of this trial back in 1993? Before you answer that, I just want to let everyone know they were originally tried separately with two different juries. Both of those juries deadlocked back in 1993 for this offense in 1998 and in 1989, where they, shotgunned both parents, murdering them in a brutal fashion. But both juries initially deadlocked. And then they went to a conjoined trial of both brothers. But Dr. Conte, how big was the trial back in 1993 when you testified?
I think it was huge. First of all, because this was a Hollywood upper middle class family, and people simply didn't want to believe that sexual abuse would take place in a family like that. And the father was a successful businessman. And so it was huge. And, it was at about the same time as the OJ trial. So family violence and sexual abuse and domestic violence were hot topics. And especially back then, the general public, I think, had a view that sexual abuse only took place in certain kinds of families, and certainly not upper middle class families who lived in Hollywood.
Ann, are you hearing me now? I would take that as a no. Ann, if you can you hear me, Ann?
Yes.
Talk to me about the original trial. You interviewed Erik for over 50 hours. Did you believe he was telling the truth? Oh, going to have an issue with that connection. Hopefully we get it fixed. Dr. Conte, you interviewed Lyle, where Ann worked primarily with Erik, and I believe you spent something like 500 hours worth of research in interviewing Lyle Menendez, not necessarily interviews, but researching him. And that included 60 hours of actual interviews with Lyle himself. I mean, that's an enormous amount of time, but what was your primary takeaway from your discussions with him over those periods of time?
Well, no mental health professional has any special ability to determine whether somebody is telling the truth or not. I certainly did not feel that he was manipulating me or lying to me or saying things that he didn't believe. So I basically believed what he said.
During your testimony, you said that he murdered because of fear and confusion. That was your quote, declaring that you had not been sold a bill of goods by him, but this fear and confusion kind of emanated after years of abuse. I mean, do you still stand by that?
Yeah, it's been a long time since I've reviewed the actual evidence that was available at the time, but I haven't learned anything since my testimony that would convince me that I was incorrect in my opinion at the time.
Ann, are you hearing me now?
Yeah, yes.
And when you testified originally, you talked a lot about the limbic portion of the brain in the original trial. But
right, I testified to both juries at different times, which I think is rather unique.
Yeah, and what was the main takeaway of your testimony?
I missed the, can you ask the question again? It didn't quite come through.
The main takeaway of your testimony that when you testified on Erik's behalf, you believed him, right?
Well, one of the things you've been asking, I think, Dr. Conte, about whether they were telling the truth. One of the things that I did with Erik, because I was, that's who I was primarily testifying about, the interviews I did, is that I had him draw the various, that last week was very critical in terms of culminating, if you will, with that Sunday night shooting. And I was impressed with the detail that he had to each of those, and each of the sessions that they talked about, and perhaps Dr. Conte has already mentioned these, were very stressful for the two brothers. So in terms of truth, I had no doubt that those incidents happened. I know that Dr. Conte had testified to them from his perspective when he talked with Lyle. And so that gave me more confidence, if you will, that the stress and the incidents leading up, because that's just before they were supposed to go back to school. And the key thing for Erik, as he told me, was that he thought he was.
Well, that connection is going to continue to be a problem. Dr. Conte, Kristen Grogan says, I've been watching the testimony of the Menendez brothers since yesterday. I could tell Erik was definitely telling the truth, and his brother was too. They don't deserve life for this. And in her testimony, since she's in and out on this, and I wish the signal was stronger, and I'll try to get her back on. She basically said in her testimony that trauma and terrorization affects brains on a psychological level, and that battered children are more vigilant, fearful, and more perceptive of victimizers' cues. Is this all stuff that you found in your own research over your many years of the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, I think what she said is well said. It also, a history of abuse and battering can also create a heightened sensitivity, so you misperceive cues. So these two young men thought their life was in danger, that the secret was going to come out about what Dad was doing to Erik, and that the father couldn't tolerate that exposure. And so they felt, and put together by various things that they observed, that the parents were going to kill them to keep the secret within the family. And so that history of mistreatment and abuse can create a heightened perception where you sometimes misperceive otherwise what might be benign events. But you construct it because you have this sense of the parent is all powerful, and you believe the parent would in fact kill you. That alone is strange. Most children don't believe. My apologies.
No worries. Having a tech fun-filled show here. Let me read a real quick comment here from Kristen Grogan. Hi, SDS Nation. I've been watching the testimony of the Menendez brothers, which I was doing as well, since yesterday. I could tell Erik was definitely telling the truth, and his brother was too. They don't deserve life for this. And then Pam Wallace, just to the magnitude of these trials, which I asked Dr. Conte about. Hi, I remember everything from the first Menendez brothers trial way back in my day. I was on the edge of my seat. And I'm not sure if you're hearing us, but if you are, can you speak to the magnitude of this trial when you testified and gave your expert testimony?
Well, the testimony that I gave was there was a tremendous stress, I think, certainly for all of us, and certainly for the brothers. What I also was impressed is both of the brothers took the stand, and they were on the stand for days. And it wasn't like you had to, they told what happened from their perspective. And how often does that happen? How many days were they on? I don't know if I think that it was certainly more than I've seen other defendants take the stand. So that was a second point that I wanted to make in looking at the sequence that they had.
And then, Anne, some of this stuff is difficult to listen to, but you talked about details that they offered, and there she goes. So, Dr. Conte, I'm going to keep doing this, I think. But Dr. Conte, Anne Burgess, in her testimony, said that Erik told her very specific things, and this is a little difficult to hear, but I'm going to go forward with it, that he would put cinnamon in his father's coffee and oatmeal, hoping to make oral sex more palatable. In the interviews that she conducted the last several years, he had his own special way, she said, of describing the abuse. And Anne's point there was that you just simply couldn't make something like that up. Is the devil, so to speak, in the details there? I mean, the fact that he would put cinnamon in his father's food so the father's ejaculate would taste differently. It's pretty serious stuff. And that doesn't sound like something that someone would be making up just to say, right?
Someone who didn't have the experience wouldn't know to make that up, right? I think Dr. Burgess is right on.
And you want to weigh in on that?
Right. I would weigh in on that also, that it'd be pretty hard to make up. And I think the other point is when you look at the letter that alleged letter that has been that Erik supposedly wrote to his cousin, he put the language. I think the language is so similar to what he talked about. So that also, I was really quite impressed to see that. And that was before with that, where he talked about the father and whether he didn't know when he would come and get him. And that's exactly what he had said in testimony. And as I said before, he had thought he was going to be able to leave the home and be able to be a student, be in a dorm at UC. And when the father said, no, that wasn't going to happen, that to me tipped the balance of the fear and what they had to do something, because Lyle was going to be able to head back to the East Coast, back to school. I think that had been worked out. I think Dr. Conte can fill in that. But for Erik, that wasn't going to be the choice.
And I'm not sure if you can see this, but Northern Ireland Nincompoop, who is joining us from Ireland, for the legend Anne Burgess. Why do you think the murders were done in such a brutal fashion? I think both of you testified that it wasn't premeditated. It was done purely out of emotion. But to this question, if you could address it.
I didn't get that, but I wanted to make one other point, if you've already gone over it. I know from the investigation prior to the trial starting, I was part of that they were pretty much on to being able to get some link in to Jose's activities with others. And that was out of Mexico. And they had, but I guess they never got clear enough information that they could bring it to trial. So I always found that with the two pieces of evidence that have alleged to come out, I think are certainly have to be looked at seriously and matches what I had seen.
Dr. Conte, just to get back to this question, why do you think the murders were done in such a brutal fashion? And I think you also testified that you thought it was not premeditated, but rather just an emotional killing. But why so brutal?
Well, shotguns are very destructive. So it depends, I guess, a little bit on what you mean by brutal. Anytime you use a shotgun, it's going to make a horrible mess and would certainly meet anybody's definition of brutal. When kids kill their parents, you have to remember that in every adult child, there is a child who remembers the parent as all powerful and controlling. And so when a child kills a parent, they may use greater force than would be necessary otherwise because of their internal sense of the parent as all powerful and all controlling. And these parents were very controlling of the kids in every sphere, sports, how they lived, where they went to school, what they did. So I think part of the so-called brutality is a function that they probably could get the shotguns easier than they could get pistols, for example. And also, when you're killing a parent, you're killing this larger than life force that has controlled you all your life and punished you, and so you're overreacting, if you will, or you're using more force than might be necessary with a neighbor because of your internal sense of the all-powerful parent.
And speaking of powerful forces, Ann Burgess, feel free to jump in. I'm just not sure if you're hearing us, but right on cue. Look at that. I have like a magic touch here with this. So you mentioned this briefly, Dr. Conte, but there were fears leading up to that that Lyle was going to expose the father. Things were heating up, and you mentioned this need to sort of protect themselves. Do you think that is finally what sort of precipitated the murders that fateful evening? That they thought maybe Lyle was going to, again, rat out the father, whatever adjective you want to use, and it drew the fear of God into them, and that's why they acted when they did.
Right.
Sure.
And they knew the father wasn't going to tolerate that exposure and embarrassment.
Well,
And
and the mother was terrified. I think the mother was very much terrified of the father too, and not wanting to go against him in any way, because that was a big problem for the boys. The brothers wanted to take Kitty, the mother, back to the East Coast. That had been one of the plans, and she refused. And that was another piece of this week that was so stressful. So when they couldn't have the mother, because the question is always asked, well, they could understand if the father was a particular fearful person, but what about the mother? And they really saw, I remember Erik saying they really saw both of them as one, the mother and the father as one.
yeah, I mean, Anne, to your point, that's always brought up. I can understand killing Jose, but why did they have to shoot Kitty the way they did? From what I understand, she had a drug problem, an alcohol problem, and basically enabled Jose. People say across the board, look, if you're being abused, there's got to be a way out besides killing.
Sure.
But did you see that in these two brothers, that there was no other way out?
Can you say that again? The brother, what was the last part of the question?
Do you feel like they had any way out, or was only through killing?
I didn't get it.
Was it only through killing, Anne?
Yeah,
Their way out?
Well, I know that there had been a question, and maybe Dr. Conte has already said this, there had been a question about whether the brothers should be tried separately. And they made it very clear that was not, they were not interested in that. They wanted to go together, because there had been some thought that maybe it would be easier on one of them if they didn't. So I don't know whether Dr. Conte has anything to say about that, but they felt that the fear and the anxiety about living there with them was so great that they were going to stay together.
Well, and Jose was a powerful figure in the extended family. So turning to an aunt for protection was not possible. There was a story that the father used to take Lyle into the basement and sit very close to him and go over and over, for example, a recent tennis game, having Lyle report everything he did in every play in the game. And one Thanksgiving that went on for hours, and the whole family is upstairs waiting for this Lyle and Dad conversation to end. But no, the family was afraid to go out and say, "Come on, Jose, we want to eat Thanksgiving dinner. So I think the whole family was somewhat fearful of Jose.
Yeah, and Dr. Conte, Sally asked this question: were both the brothers emotionally, socially inept, or stunted, which made them odd and possibly dangerous by not being able to verbalize the abuse they were experiencing? Did you find that?
Yeah.
I found Lyle immature, but I wouldn't say socially inept. He had friends, he had beautiful girlfriends. I think he was appropriately social for his developmental age, but I don't think that either of the boys had access to protectors outside of the family or even within the family that they could turn to. And again, mother was perceived as a co-conspirator with dad, so they couldn't go to mom and say what dad is doing and get help. So I think the reason they didn't disclose is the reason most victims don't disclose. They're afraid to disclose. They're not sure who to disclose to. They're afraid of the consequences. And again, it was the fear of disclosing that convinced, and what the consequences would be, that convinced these young men that the parents were going to kill them. So that's a pretty strong incentive not to disclose.
Dr. Conte, what did you make? And feel free to weigh in, because I'm not sure what you're hearing, but let me just ask Dr. Conte first. What did you think about this guy from Menudo who came forward? His name is Roy Rossello, basically corroborating Lyle and Erik's story, saying that he himself was raped by Jose Menendez when he was in New Jersey. And a reminder to everyone that Jose Menendez was the head of RCA Records, a powerful person. I guess two questions to you. What do you think of the, what he is offering up now in terms of its veracity? And also, people always say, well, why did he wait so long? But you deal with these sorts of, situations frequently. Why do you think he waited this many years?
I don't know what his individual situation is, but you got to remember, most sexual abuse isn't disclosed until well into adulthood. And he may have had reasons that had to do with fear of retaliation or what impact that would have on his career. I don't know, but victims often don't disclose for long periods of time. Another thing to remember is that most sex offenders are polyperverse. And incest offenders don't just abuse children in their own home, they abuse children outside of the home. So the fact that here's an unrelated young male coming forward now, albeit later than we would have liked, saying, yeah, this happened to me, it's not surprising if you understand sexual offenders. And there's clear data that incest offenders act out against children outside of their own home.
Yeah.
And
I was just going to say, I certainly would echo that. You have to think back to the culture and the times.
It's a bummer that she's having such a tough time. Dr. Conte, back to you. Man, it's bumming me out that this connection is rough on her. But in the first trial, or the second trial, I should say, the state and the judge basically said, look, leave sexual abuse out of this. Just talk about the evidence and the facts of the case. Could you imagine that ever happening in the culture and society we live in today? And I mean, how different would it be if all these allegations were allowed to be heard by the jurors?
Yeah, I think we're in a totally different age. So many survivors have come forward, the Me Too movement and other movements. Most Americans are now aware that sexual abuse takes place and that it takes place in contexts that you often wouldn't imagine, like Beverly Hills families. So yeah, I think it would be a totally different. I can't imagine today that a judge would rule that such an important aspect of the motivation for the deaths couldn't be allowed.
I think not only that, but look at how legislation has changed. That they put in, especially for child victims, that they've extended the time because of the problem of delayed disclosure, that they have well extended it so that the victims can come forward and appeal if they have a civil suit.
Dr. Conte, again, I apologize to everyone, but Anne is in a very remote location and she's trying a hotspot and it's not working too well, as you can tell. But
it makes my day to be a stand-in for a legend. So,
Dr. Conte, to you, a couple questions. Have you spoken to Lyle since he's been in prison?
No.
You haven't. Are you interested in speaking to him or reconnecting with him?
It keeps saying try again. It comes in from your side, not from mine. I don't think it's from my side.
I'm sorry, Anne.
And I don't know if Dr. Conte's talking or Joel, you're talking. I'm sorry.
And the best you want to try to go onto your phone. Do it from your phone. Try
no,
that.
I'm not using my phone. Isn't on. No.
Try to do it from your phone. Can you?
Try to do it with my phone.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go hop off the computer and try it on your phone.
Just the phone.
Yeah. So I'm gonna hop off. Go to the link in your email and your go to the link in your phone email and try it that way. Dr. Conte, me and you. Another question that I have, which I'm trying to understand, and you're an expert in this field, using Jose Menendez as the obvious example, when he's molesting his children in this horrific, horrible, graphic way, I mean, having anal intercourse with them and all this, is it a sexual gratification or a power thing or a combination of both?
That's a great question, and it's been complicated in the field by different theoretical models. It's both sexual and power. For many offenders, the arousal is to the power. So you can't say that sexual abuse is just about power because it's arousal to power.
Mm. And Dr. Conte, the other big issue in play right now is this letter from his cousin, Mr. Cano, who is since deceased. But Cano, at the first trial, testified that when Erik was 13, that he came to him and told him that his father, Jose, was touching and massaging his genital areas. They called it penis massages. And he really confided in him. He died of an overdose, but in 2018, his own mother, Cano's mother, gave a letter to a journalist, and that's how that resurfaced now. Does that letter sort of justify what they were saying all these many years, 30 years later? Does it reinforce everything that they alleged?
Yeah, I would call it the letter a disguised disclosure. It doesn't specifically say what Dad was doing, but it said Dad was doing it again, which implies that the cousin knew what Erik was writing about, and then he refers to his dad as a monster. I think that's pretty supportive evidence. Had it been available at the time of the trial, I think would have been quite important.
And then again, Dr. Conte, in the original trial of Erik Menendez, I know you were a little bit more focused on Lyle, but without Anne here, I'm going to have you pick it up. The state called the abuse fiction, quote, and I'm quoting there. Again, that would never fly in a courtroom today. Basically, Erik said that he was being molested from age 6 to 18. And again, the state came out and literally called that fiction and also warned the jury, the judge did, Judge Stanley Weisberg, warned the jurors not to take Ann Burgess's testimony as quote unquote gospel. What do you make of all that in retrospect 3 decades later?
Well, I think it's a strange ruling for a court to tell a person who is clearly qualified as an expert and whose function in the court is to provide information to the jury that is outside of what the average person knows. to discredit an expert whose qualifications and whose testimony and cross-examination should stand for itself, I think is unheard of.
And then you said, related to Lyle, that there was great confusion and great anxiety. That was a quote of yours. And said that they killed their parents in the TV room of the Beverly Hills mansion in this period of great confusion and great anxiety. And after you said that, under oath, the state came back at you. Her name was the Deputy District Attorney Pamela Bozanich. She asked you then what's that?
I remember her well.
She asked you to explain, if it was such a period of confusion and great anxiety, how did the brothers know to immediately pick up all the shotgun shells to hide incriminating evidence? Was that, they asked, an act of confusion and anxiety? What's your response to that now that you've had a few days to think about it?
A few days. Well, I think people do strange things when they commit bad acts, and it wouldn't be surprising that they would try to clean up, move the shells, whatever. You know, they're operating on adrenaline and fear, and they've just done something that's horrible, and they've witnessed it being done. So in a panic state, I don't think it's surprising that they might try to clean up.
And Letitia here has a question for you, Dr. Conte. How do you think the brothers' relationship with each other influenced their decisions that Sunday? I mean, if they didn't have one another to lean on, would this ever have happened, in your opinion? And did it happen because they did have each other to lean on?
I think Lyle was guilty for not protecting his brother. And when he heard what his father was doing, when his brother told him, he believed the brother because it had been done to him by the father. And so there was this sense that I should have done something in the past, and I could have protected my brother from it happening. And in a family, in a very dysfunctional family, the kids often have to rely on each other for support, because you can't rely on anyone else.
And I don't know if you remember this, but you sort of snapped back at Deputy District Attorney Pamela Bozanich when she asked you that question about why would they pick up the shotgun shell casings. You said, as you just said, but a little more, people do strange things in traumatic situations. And you said, ma'am, Jackie Kennedy tried to get on the back of a limousine to get her husband's skull, which is an act you can't really, make sense of, obviously, unless you're in that situation, you're the wife of the president. But to your point, that did make a lot of sense. You said that he was never dishonest with you, meaning Lyle Menendez. Do me a favor, just take us back to that period of time. You spoke to him or interviewed him for 60 hours. Can you just tell us how that all played out? Was that a court mandated thing where they put you in touch with him? Did you speak to him on the phone? How was that all happening?
His defense attorneys contacted me and asked me to evaluate him. And so I visited him in the LA County Jail. And then also at one point went to New Jersey to interview his cousins and his aunt and some of his relatives. And I do what I call a developmental profile. So I talked to Lyle about his whole life from his earliest memory moving forward, including a description of the key event, in this case, the abuse. Again, I'm not a human lie detector, no mental health professional is, but I do look for consistencies and inconsistencies in how somebody describes events. And I've talked to a great many victims, and victims vary in their experience, but you can often tell when somebody is exaggerating because they're trying to have an impact on you. Again, I'm not 100% a lie detector test, but I've talked to so many people who claim to have been abused that when I feel like it's being exaggerated or where it's just not possible.
Yeah.
And the story they told about the family and the mother and the dad's control and mom's abuse, both physical and emotional. You know, when Lyle talked about coming home from school and his mother had hung his wet bed sheets out his bedroom window, his description of the embarrassment and the shame of that was very, very consistent with somebody who had that experience.
I've mentioned this on the show. Obviously, you weren't here because it's the first time you've been a guest, but I grew up in New Jersey, not far from them. A lot of people didn't even know they lived in New Jersey, but I played tennis with them. They were a gazillion times better, but they would play on court 1 at the East Brunswick Racket Club, and I would play on court 2. They were phenomenal athletes. I mean, good enough to play college level tennis. And I had friends in common and obviously a tennis coach in common. And I'll never forget one time a group of my friends that were friendly with them, and they were very popular. They were good looking guys. They were very popular, dated pretty women, the whole, kind of jock stereotype. But one story that always stood out was they had a party one weekend when the parents were away in high school, and someone spilled red wine on a very white carpet in the home. And the reaction from Lyle and Erik was real fear. Like, my parents are going to kill me. It wasn't like, something you would say, oh, my parents are going to kill me. Like, they were terrified, asked everyone to leave. Does that sort of fall in line with all these allegations of abuse, that they would be terrified that kind of wine stain ended up on a white carpet in their home before their parents were set to get back?
Yeah, it fits with over control. And you're in trouble if you act out, and red wine on white carpet is certainly acting out.
Yeah. Have you tried to follow the case over the years? I mean, there've been numerous, Dateline episodes and podcasts. Do you keep up on it? Is it still of interest to you?
I would say that the welfare of the brothers is of interest to me. I haven't kept current in the various television shows and that kind of thing. I haven't revisited it. I know Dr. Burgess recently told me she had just reviewed my testimony, which I can't imagine doing myself. But
yeah, Dr. Ann, if you can hear us, did you review Dr. Conte's testimony? What do you think of it?
Just stay here. Thank you. Joel, I'm back.
Yeah. Dr. Conte said you reviewed his testimony. What did you make of it all these years later?
I didn't get. Can you put the question in the chat or somewhere?
Yeah, let me try to do that.
That's much better. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mentioned that you had recently told me you reviewed my testimony, and Joel asked, "What did you think of it?"
Oh, okay.
Maybe John should ask the question. Yeah.
I know that I was there have been a lot of young people kind of organizing this is probably 2-3 years ago, where they really were trying to do something.
Oh boy. As they say, that is a buzzkill. We're going to get Ann back on a better night to go over this, but I have the other legend, John Conte, here to help me out with a lot of great comments too. One of the things Ann said, Dr. Conte, was the night of the killings, the parents and the sons got into an argument in the mansion foyer, and the parents closed the door to the TV room. Erik Menendez, she said, when they closed that door, he viewed that action as a sign of imminent danger. An outsider might not view the closing of the door that way, she said, but Erik Menendez was hyper vigilant after years of abuse. His brain biologically altered to be attuned to cues that outsiders would ignore, she said. Was that the kind of the fatal and final nail in the proverbial coffin when they closed that door? Was that what really freaked Erik out and ultimately made Erik and Lyle act?
Yeah, I think that was one of the things. And again, that's a misperception based on hyperarousal and hypervigilance. In another family, parents closing the door would not have had much meaning. But in the context of that family and this belief that the parents were going to kill them, that took on much greater significance than it would have in another family.
And then Dr. Conte.
Joel, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I've got you, Ann. I hear you.
Okay. If you put a question in the box, I ought to be able to answer it. That's probably
we were just talking about your testimony about them closing the door in the foyer area the night of the murders. Do you recall that?
Do I recall what?
That when Kitty and Jose closed the door in the foyer area, and you believe that sort of triggered Lyle and Erik. And there she goes. We're going to have to... Dr. John Conte is never going to come back on. He's like, what have you gotten me into here? But Dr. Conte, there's another like huge curveball in all this, and that is Dr. Leon Oziel, a real character, and that's putting it mildly, unethical psychologist who ultimately was who lost his license. But how big a factor did he play? And just for those who don't know, he was a therapist for the brothers. Erik was ordered to go see Dr. Leon Oziel after he was involved with some burglaries of some friends' houses. He was actually a sex therapist who didn't typically see children, especially children who were, child abuse victims. But how big a problem was Dr. Oziel for the Menendez brothers in all this?
I don't know what the jury made of it. I think it was quite an issue at the time because he was supposed.
There you are. Can you hear me now, Joel?
Yeah, I have you, Ann.
Hello?
Feel free to just chime in, Ann. Yeah, that connection's horrible. Go ahead, John.
I think it was, I don't know what the jury made of it, but it was quite a big deal at the time because this, again, was supposed to be a therapist and was not acting necessarily in the best interest of his client.
And then here's a question for you, Dr. Conte. What do you believe was the difference in impact between Lyle's sexual abuse by his mother and by his father? There were some allegations that the mother was involved in some ways. Did you ever find that?
Okay, the question is, why do you believe there was a difference in impact between Lyle by his mother and by his father?
And you want to take that?
Well, they're always different.
How so? And can you hear me? That's an affirmative note. Dr. Conte, what about that? Any difference in the impact here?
I don't know that there's a difference in the psychological impact, but there clearly is the creation of a sense that the parents are one unit. They both behave badly in the same way, and they both have they both have a reason not to want it to come out.
This question here by Rosanna Vitale, and this is an interesting question because a lot of people think in some weird way there was a connection here. The OJ Simpson, their first trial, Lyle and Erik, came prior to OJ. Then we had the OJ trial. He was acquitted, and there was a huge uproar, as we know. It was the trial of the century. So the question here, Dr. Conte, is...
Joel, can you hear me now?
I have you, Ann. I think the connection is pretty horrendous, but you can feel free to chime in, Ann.
I'll just hold in here.
And maybe you could comment on the impact of the possible abuse by mother versus
the host has muted me.
Yeah. Ann, if you can hear me, try the phone, Ann.
Try the phone. We tried the phone.
Didn't work. I think I'm gonna have to pick it back, Ann. I think we'll have to pick it up once you get back to Boston. I'll do a whole thing with you on this.
I think we're gonna have to, because
All right.
Yeah, it's too hard for me to hear.
I'll go the rest of the way with John. When you get back to Boston, I'll have you on and we'll do it again.
Okay, we'll do it back in Boston. Okay.
All right. Have a great trip.
Okay. I'll sign off. Okay.
Okay.
You know, Joel, there was a question a minute ago about kind of what conversations increased my belief in what Lyle was telling me. And one of the things I remember was when he admitted doing to his brother the same things that the father had done to him. And his disclosure of that, which is obviously highly stigmatizing and embarrassing, just felt to me to be a true disclosure of a brother who was full of guilt and shame that he had abused his own brother.
Back to this OJ question, because it's sort of interesting. Do you think there was any kind of correlation? Do you think if OJ was convicted that maybe the brothers would have been acquitted? I mean, they're different juries, different years, different days, but just because of the kind of the zeitgeist at the time, do you think that things could have been different with a different outcome in the OJ case?
Well, I think there was disbelief about OJ's history of battering. So in that sense, there was the same sort of disbelief that a cultural hero like OJ would actually be a domestically violent husband. So the extent to which denial plays in, I'm not sure.
And then, Dr. Conte, I know you wanted Ann to address this, but please ask the doctor who saw Lyle, that'd be you, to explain the sexual assault by both the mother and father, as he claimed. Did you ever find that was a true statement, that he was in fact being abused by both?
I didn't question it when he disclosed it.
This here is for Ann, but I'm going to toss it to you, obviously. Can you explain how the crime scene showed lack of planning? Is there any evidence that you can point to that showed it was really strictly emotion, as Ann testified to?
You know, that's actually an area where Dr. Burgess has really done some of the more important research. So I would really defer to her. And I know she testified about that at the trial.
And, there's a whole other side of this, politics. You got the left, you have the right. Here you have those who say the brothers should be freed, those who say they should remain in prison. Star Dancer obviously believes Erik and Lyle deserve to remain in prison. Being abused did not give them the right to slaughter their parents. The mother was crawling away as she was being blasted in the head. How do you respond to this comment?
Well, I agree. I don't think anything gives the right to one human being to take the life of another human being. The issue is that in the law, you do have a right to act in self-defense. So if these brothers actually believed that their parents were going to kill them, then the homicides were an act of self-defense. And again, I don't believe in murder, and I certainly don't like kids killing parents, but our law says that you have a right to defend yourself or a loved one like your brother. So if we don't believe in imperfect self-defense, the self-defense that a person who's been battered over many years irrationally assumes that certain indicators are an evidence they're about to be murdered. You know, if we don't want to make that a legitimate defense, then we should advocate to change the law. It's the same law that explains why some domestic violent victims kill their partner when the partner's asleep in bed. And it has to do with fear, misperception of the immediacy of a violent act. And we recognize it with battered women and also battered children.
Sarah weighing in. Sarah, I saw you have, by the way, Apologies for the way I say her name. Inside joke here, Dr. Conte. But Sarah, to you, I hope you're feeling better. I read that you had COVID. You've got the best community in true crime here, Dr. Conte. So making sure STS Nation is healing up and feeling well. Have chicken soup, Sarah. And as my mother would say, these are Upper East Side problems, my connection with Ann. But I will go and cry myself to sleep tonight because I wanted Ann to be on so badly. She warned me she might have spotty service, and she did. But I can promise you guys we'll get Ann on hopefully next week, and we will go through all this with Ann point by point. But we've got the legend, Dr. John Conte, in the house for a few more minutes on this, and I want to continue to pick his brain for a little while. Dr. Conte, you spent 40 some odd years studying this and working at the University of Washington, obviously one of their most prolific and high profile faculty members. What's drawn you to this your whole career, and what keeps you interested in it all these years later?
That's a great question and very personal, but I will share. My mother was physically abused as a child, and I grew up hearing stories about her life experiences with her father. She was a somewhat atypical situation. My maternal grandfather was a paranoid schizophrenic, so he was mentally ill, and he kind of focused on my mother. So I think hearing those stories kind of drove me to want to be a therapist for victims and to study victimization process. And it's really quite an honor for somebody with a horrible life to invite you in and share their life experience with you, either as part of a civil case or a criminal case.
This guy, Dr. Oziel, is kind of a horrible person. I hate to say it, but I think it's the truth. By the way, he's now running, he lost his license, and I read he's now running sex seminars out of somewhere in Oregon for a living. I guess everyone's got to make a living. But he claimed, Dr. Conte, at one point that Lyle had physically threatened him. But there was another witness there, a woman named Judalyn Smith, who completely denied that. But he really stooped to some low levels. Was this just a bad draw of the cards for Lyle Menendez that he got caught up, and Erik Menendez that they got caught up with this guy? He also taped them, and this taping was used as sort of a informal confession, but it sounded, beyond unethical, bordering on criminal. But what did you make of it when you discovered all this?
Well, I think that when you're Menendez brothers and you're raised in a totally dysfunctional family, your ability to judge the character of other people is significantly impaired. So whatever nonverbal signs Dr. Oziel was giving off that he could be trusted, it's not surprising that Lyle wouldn't pick up on that, because his own father was not the most ethical person in the world. And if you can't recognize it in your father, how do you recognize it in another male?
Sarah's back, COVID and all. She's asking, did you ever get a specific, this is a great question, sort of obvious, but not obvious enough for me, but did you ever get a specific reason from Lyle why he did it? Did he ever say, Dr. Conte, this is exactly why it happened?
He thought they were going to be killed. So it was a self-defense. In the law, we'd call it imperfect self-defense. A reasonable person raised in a different family would have not put all those cues together and come to the conclusion that my parents are going to kill me. But because of the history of battering and mistreatment, these boys, and they fed off each other by taking various cues and believing that their death was imminent. And then I think also, as Ann pointed out earlier, I think the fact that Erik was going to escape and going back to Princeton, where his dad had arranged for him to have a condo and had arranged to have a girlfriend. The dad controlled every aspect of Lyle's life, including who he dated. So Lyle was going to escape. So the two of them were kind of in this heightened state of arousal and concern that the parents are going to keep the secret of the abuse. And the only way to do that was to prevent the disclosure by killing their children.
Letitia raised an interesting point. For the people who think the brothers should have simply left, even if we ignore the psychological aspect of leaving, do you all wish a serial child rapist and his accomplice had gotten away with it? What interests me about this is, we just covered a case in Boston where a man is now indicted for the murder of his wife. She went missing. It turns out he was, allegedly a big control freak. And then there's a whole question, around domestic violence and how difficult it is to leave. Some people say, well, the brothers should have just left, no reason to murder. But how much more difficult is it to do than say in reality, Dr. Conte?
Well, again, it's incredibly difficult if your parents are controlling. And the young man had no money other than what the parents gave them. And again, the father arranged for Lyle to return to Princeton and continue college. And it had all been set up with a condo and a girlfriend and all this. So I think it's hard for many young people to leave home, but especially when you have a disturbed attachment with your parents, it's particularly difficult to leave. And if there'd been one other family member that they could rely on, an aunt or even a cousin, then perhaps, for example, why did the cousin, whose now a letter has now been discovered, why did the cousin not say something?
Ellie Robinson, Dr. Conte, do you think Kitty had something akin to Stockholm Syndrome where she was, I don't know, just sort of unable to reach in and help because she was also affected by her husband?
Yes, absolutely.
You do. Would it be, would you describe it as Stockholm Syndrome or something different?
Well, I don't think she was physically abused, but I think she was in this house where the father was the king, and whatever the father wanted to do, including, again, disrupting family Thanksgiving by doing this indoctrination in the basement with Lyle, I think she was pretty tightly controlled.
Raquel Beck's here, and this gets to another point, a big point that I wanted to ask you about, and then we'll start to wrap up because I know your time is very valuable. Dr. Conte and Dr. Burgess, what do you think of the burglaries they committed as teens and Lyle being suspended for plagiarism? But the bigger question here, Dr. Conte, is those who say that, including the state back then, but today, critics who say they should stay in prison often say, look, they were greedy. They went on a spending spree. There's actually video I saw the other night of them sitting courtside at a Lakers game back in the day after the murders. So how do you address the fact that they did go on sort of a materialistic splurge with the parents' money? Or do you just say that they were still acting irrationally from all these years of kind of perpetual abuse?
They always spent money. At one point, Lyle went into a polo shop and bought $2,000 worth of shirts. And the father wasn't upset. He said, good, it'll improve his image. So these people spent money. And the burglaries, it's kind of adolescent acting act. It's thrill seeking. The plagiarism, this is a family that was not the most ethical. When the father was at RCA, he would send out a lot of records to stores so he could claim to have higher sales. And then when the records came back, because the record store didn't really want them, then the profit would go down. So this was not the most, these young men didn't have examples of ethical behavior.
Mia, the questions are flowing in now, Dr. Conte. Do you believe that Lyle and Erik exaggerated or minimized the extent of abuse that they were subjected to? And I'll add a caveat, specifically when they were speaking, when Lyle was speaking with you. Do you think he was telling you the full-on extent of it?
Yes, because he didn't appear to be overly excited to tell me he wasn't telling me more and more. People who exaggerate tend to really exaggerate. And he did not. He just told the bare minimum of what happened.
Roxanne says these two were living a lavish life while both the mother and the father are intimate with them. Makes no sense. But look, they were a wealthy family. They had a lot of money. He was a president of RCA Records. And Dr. Conte said, you still live your lives, even if you're abuse victims to a great extent. I guess that's what they were doing. Dr. Conte, I was going to ask you, speaking of that, you've obviously spoken to thousands, if not tens of thousands of victims of child sex abuse. Have you seen reactions as severe as this, or, is this a complete outlier? Have you had other patients or clients who have murdered as a result?
Yes, not a large number because it's a fairly rare event. It's not always a victim kills a parent either. Sometimes the victim will kill a teacher or whoever the offender is. It's not necessarily a family member. So it's a rare event, and it's understandable if you can get into the psychology and how the victim understood what was happening to them and why they chose to act out in such a violent way.
Team asks if they were, this has come up a few times. It's a great question. I think if they were the Menendez girls instead of the Menendez boys, would they be in jail for life right now? Would it have been perceived differently?
I think it would have been perceived differently. You also have to remember, though, girls are less likely to use guns. So the girls may have acted out in some other way. So it may not have been a homicide ultimately. But yeah, I mean, believing that these good looking, smooth, rich white boys who lived in Hollywood would be abused was very hard to swallow back in that time period. I think now with the Me Too movement, it would be easier to accept.
GX, Dr. Conte, was Lyle emotional while talking to you? And were those emotions sincere, in your opinion? I was watching some of the testimony last night, and both Erik and Lyle, broke down, and you can tell, a la Alec Murdaugh trial we just covered. The jurors all said they were crocodile tears. There was no, water coming out of those eyes, but you could tell that, you could really tell that Lyle and Erik were really affected. But when he was speaking to you, did he get emotional?
Not like he did on the stand. And people rarely do because it's a much different pace. And if I sense emotion beginning to rise, I will divert to another subject because I don't want them to become so emotionally overloaded that they can't give accurate information.
Is it
overly emotional?
I mean, is it sort of natural human instinct, especially amongst men or boys, to sort of cover the emotion a little bit and just tell you the facts without the emotion?
Yeah, absolutely. To suppress emotion.
So there's a couple of things going on here, and then as I promised, we will start to wrap. Mark Garagos, famed criminal defense attorney. He's been both the boys, now men's attorneys for a very long time. He filed a writ of habeas corpus, and he said that usually he expects to hear back from the court in about a 45-day period. He's either looking for a retrial or basically a vacating of the conviction, an overturning of the conviction. Do you believe that is, and I think I started with this, do you think that that's what should happen at this point? Do they deserve to be out?
I do. I think that the defense they put on was an accurate defense. And for historical reasons, the fact that they were boys and it was involved sexual abuse, it wasn't believed, even though I thought there was evidence that supported their claim that they were in fear of their lives and they were acting in self-defense when they took their parents' lives.
And do you have any fear or trepidation that if they were to be freed, that they would ever commit murders of this nature and magnitude again, or do you think that they are not violent people by nature?
They're not violent people by nature.
And a final question for you. So we did an episode just the other day. We've been covering the case quite a bit. And I found out that Lyle and Erik almost certainly are watching this in prison. They've got access. And I know that at least one of the wives watched the other episode. Do you have any message to Lyle or Erik if they are watching you tonight, all these years later?
No, I actually sent a message to the Netflix director that I wish them well, and I hope things improve with this new evidence.
Well, listen, I cannot thank you enough. I am going to need your therapy to get over the fact that Anne had a bad connection, because that really bums me out. Of course, if I go through Anne's resume, we'll be here for another 20 minutes, but she's a legend in the field, as is Dr. Conte. Dr. Conte is still a University of Washington professor and scholar. His area of expertise centers on mental health issues related to child abuse and trauma. He's been at the school since 1990. He founded the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. He's the editor of the Journal of Interpersonal Violence and Trauma. Just one last thing for you. If there's someone out there who's younger, who is being abused, or a cousin that knows that a parent is abusing their child, what advice do you have for those people?
To find a trusted adult who they can disclose to. And I might suggest people go to www.fightchildabuse.org, and the Barbara Sinatra Children's Center and I have developed a series of animated sex abuse prevention videos, including a video called Stop the Secrets That Hurt, which is designed for victims who have not yet disclosed. So the important thing is to find somebody you can trust and disclose.
Dr. Conte, what always amazes me about the more important people in my life, and I've interviewed a lot of them, is they're always the most humble. You can tell Dr. Conte is humble, even though he's made a huge difference. And we live in a materialistic world. I live in Miami, the home of Ferraris and Lamborghinis, but the lives that you've changed and affected in your career, Dr. Conte, I'm sure are innumerable, and there's no amount of money that could have been spent to make the changes that you've helped to affect. So want to thank you. Yeah,
and I consider Anne a mentor, so it's great to be on the same screen with her.
Yeah, and we'll try to get you either both back, but to my audience, I am definitely getting Anne back as early as next week to go over her side of this whole case. And STS Nation, I'm going to need a couple of nice tweets because I'm going to go weep myself to bed soon. But I'm happy we had Dr. Conte. Bummed we didn't get Dr. Burgess. And thank you, Dr. Conte. Love you, America. Love you, Seattle. Love you, Boston, where Ann is, and everyone in between. Tomorrow, 5 p.m. Eastern time, we'll be back with Detective Phil Waters and Scott Duffy. Thanks again, Dr. Conte.
My pleasure. Take care.